Hello. Today is the matchup graph video. Wide receivers, then quarterbacks, then running backs. That adjusted matchup rank on the bottom. Just how good or bad is that fantasy defense against each position compared to their schedule that they've had so far. And then the projected volume on the left, how valuable that volume is projected to be on the week. So wide receivers first, and as always, start with the shadows. There's not really many at least. Egbuka has Christian Benford, and that is not too much of a difference compared to normal. Doesn't really help, doesn't really hurt. Egbuka, I've loved him. Even recently, when he had his struggles for a little bit of not scoring touchdowns, he's still in a great situation, still getting amazing volume. And without those receivers there, must start every week. Great last week. Sure, he'll be good again this week in a spot versus Buffalo. The interesting one is DK Metcalf. Down here in the bottom left in the red, which is surprising because they played the Bengals. He's had this matchup before. He's going to be shadowed by DJ Turner. He had 4 targets, 3 catches, I think, 50 yards. Last time they played, maybe 2 catches, 50 yards, something like that, where it wasn't the greatest. So the big factor here is the other players in terms of that Pittsburgh offense. They had 80 receiving points in PPR for running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers in terms of receiving PPR fantasy points. 80 that were not for DK Metcalf in week 7. So Freiermuth, Calvin Austin, maybe Jaylen Warren, especially, like all of them. Metcalf still not in a bad situation, I would say, just because the Bengals, they've allowed the most points in the NFL. They're bottom in the league in terms of explosive pass plays allowed. So Metcalf, he can break a couple. He can still have really high touchdown upside, just maybe a little bit lower volume compared to those other players, but still fine spot overall, I would say. For the Bengals on the other side, Chase and Higgins, you see over on the right here, set up extremely well. Chase, top right, number 1 volume in the week. I think JSN at the number 2. He's projected for like 11 targets. Chase is projected for over 13, which it makes sense. Pittsburgh, they might be without Darius Slay. And in terms of the entire secondary as a whole, it's been really bad against receivers. Higgins set up really well too. He had 10 targets and a ton of points, over 20, last time that they played Pittsburgh in that week 7 game. Really matches up well against both their corners, but also just their coverage schemes and everything. They play a lot of those single high safeties, what I was talking about in Fast Facts, where Higgins 123% better in terms of fantasy points per route versus single high this year as that downfield X receiver compared to too high when it kind of limits that a little bit more. So Higgins set up a little bit better than normal. A guy that I love this week and now basically weekly is Jaylen Waddle. But this week in particular, Washington, they're already like bottom 5 in terms of fantasy, obviously here, against receivers and just the passing game in general. But overall now, they are 32nd in a lot of the per play stats. So when the Dolphins, who have a defense that can probably keep them in the game, Waddle benefits him even more. And you have both of those outside corners that are going to miss this game and miss the rest of the season, basically. So going forward, but in this matchup too, Jaylen Waddle, easy must start for this week, I would say. Looking at the other 2 Vikings receivers, Jefferson and Jordan Addison. Jefferson, the volume is there. The matchup is there. His on-target rate is at least better than Jordan Addison's. The way they use him, it's a little bit easier to get him involved in more creative ways than Addison's. More that downfield threat where it can be great when the quarterback play is okay in this offense, but a little bit more risky, obviously. In terms of the Chicago defense, still not doing great against wide receivers. They've improved in areas, but against receivers, ever since their bye week, 5th most yards per game allowed. So it's not like they've gotten too much better there. The Chargers are in an interesting spot here. So we got Quinn Johnson all the way on the right, Keenan Allen, pretty solid, and then Ladd McConkey on the left. This is because of their alignment, going off of that for this graph. So Johnston, over 80% of the time, going to be on the outside, where Jacksonville's been 31st. But surprisingly, they've been number 1 against slot receivers. And that's where McConkey, a lot of his work is coming. He'll get out of the slot sometimes, and he'll get those downfield shots. And this isn't a sit McConkey. It's just a little bit of a downgrade for him and a big upgrade for Johnston, I would say, especially with his just ceiling potential in this matchup. Allen, I'm losing hope a little bit, at least rest of the season don't have him as high as I would maybe 4 weeks ago, just because what we've seen, he's probably the most affected of these receivers in terms of the pressure that's now allowed with the offensive line in shambles. So McConkey, solid wide receiver 2, Johnston, a solid flex play, Allen, he's fine, but don't love it. He'll have his weeks though. Nico Collins has already had Tennessee before. He played L'Jarius Sneed though, so 6 targets, 4 catches, 80 yards, and I would expect somewhat similar, maybe a little bit lower volume because that Houston defense against Tennessee's offense is not the greatest mix for Nico Collins. but that efficiency should be there. So it's still at 80 yards last game. You're hoping he gets in the end zone. You're hoping he's the reason that they're kind of winning this game. This secondary is not nearly as good as their 19th rank against receivers. It's just usually that game script. So it just kind of depends on how early he can get going. That'll be a big part of it, but L'Jarius Sneed not being in there definitely helps him. McMillan slightly in this red. I actually think it's worse than what it looks like on this graph. Volume hasn't been bad, but he's really had not too many great games recently. Over 60 yards in one of those games. It hasn't been bad. It's just he's not really having any of those ceiling games. Like, he doesn't have a touchdown outside of that 2-touchdown game versus the Cowboys, which kind of everybody does. He plays Atlanta this week. AJ Terrell will be on him a decent amount. Last time he played them, 8 targets, 3 catches, 48 yards. So volume was there, but that efficiency again with Bryce Young just really hasn't. So I feel like it's still a lower ceiling. It gets a really good passing defense. And speaking of lower ceiling, sadly, Franklin and Sutton in this bottom left. And then you got Worthy right next to him in that same matchup. I just don't love it overall. The Denver receivers, they've been more dependent on touchdowns and then shots against man coverage. Kansas City's really good at that. Denver, even better on the opposite side, where Worthy is pretty similar. He's been really bad ever since Rashee Rice came back, so don't love any of those three. Did you know Justin Herbert, top 3 quarterback in 3 out of his last 4 games? Been incredible. Another great matchup this week. I don't think they're 31st. If we were to make like a subjective ranking, that's not where I would have Jacksonville, but they don't pressure the quarterback too much. They're not a good secondary overall. So still like Herbert this week as that like fringe top 5 level of quarterback after he's been so good. When we're looking at the bottom right, it's just the week of the not great fantasy quarterbacks that have amazing matchups. There's a whole bunch of them in this bottom right corner. My favorite would be Rodgers in the Yunk Bowl against Flacco. Had 23 fantasy points against them last time. Set up really well again. Their top 2 pass rushers, their top 2 defensive linemen, both out again. So Rodgers shouldn't, again, like Herbert, face too much pressure, which is huge for him. Should be able to have the time to get the ball out. And I'm guessing that they're still going to be throwing a decent amount inside that red zone. Lots of scoring opportunities overall. Darnold, not bad either, in a spot where he's like playing really well compared to these other quarterbacks in that range. Just usually not the greatest in fantasy because of that volume. Looking at Dak Prescott over in this top left. Back-to-back poor games recently. Hasn't been the greatest, but I think he still matches up well against the Raiders here. Again, he's over here because of the game script. The Raiders not doing too well on offense, if you haven't heard. So, quarterbacks against them don't have to do too much. But in terms of EPA per pass, they're actually 24th. So you would be in the green if, say, it's a close game, where the Raiders are projected for 24 points this week. That's how bad the Dallas defense is. The Dallas Cowboys are projected for 28. So if that rings close to true, Dak should be fine there. Mahomes in this top left, he's the number 1 quarterback in fantasy right now. Incredible. Still, Denver defense makes it tough. Quarterback 1 in fantasy for sure in terms of the rankings this week, but in terms of choosing my favorite one, he wouldn't be up there. If we look at Denver's defense, they have 2 games this year where they've allowed multiple passing touchdowns, 2 times. They've allowed 0 touchdown passes in 5 games. Half of them, over half, maybe. And kind of a flip for the running backs in terms of where the quarterbacks were. All the running backs that are getting elite level volume or projected forward this week have great matchups. Etienne, Dowdle, Jacobs, Jeanty, Warren, all up in that top right. So let's start with Warren. Bengals, they're 32nd. Their 2 defensive linemen, like I was saying, out. That's not helping them. They're 32nd against receiving running backs, which helps for Warren, especially if he's just out on the field a ton, running those routes as well. He's set up beautifully. Last time when they played, I'm pretty sure off the top of my head, let me look real quick. He had a lot of touches and played extremely well, but in fantasy wasn't the greatest because he didn't score. Yeah, still 17 fantasy points in PPR, but didn't have a touchdown. Would be shocked if that happened again. I would project about 20 touches. Wouldn't be shocked at all if he got into the end zone. Rico, the last time this team played Atlanta, Hubbard was the starting quarterback. He still had a touchdown on like 10 carries or something like that, but that was the game where they won 30-0. So it is nice that it's projected to be a closer game because even though Atlanta's defense is so good and Bryce Young is playing pretty bad, their rushing defense isn't great. So the Panthers can rely on Rico. I'm guessing he gets a big time volume, and the Atlanta offense hasn't been too impressive this year. They're 27th in scoring right now compared to being like 13th last year. Jeanty also set up. A lot of it will come down to the receiving for Ashton Jeanty, I think, this week. Back-to-back 5-target games. That's good. Dallas is horrid against receiving running backs this year, but they're actually probably underrated, not good, not good, underrated against rushing production on the ground for running backs. A lot of it is more just, yeah, they allow a lot of touchdowns in the red zone to the rushing, but in terms of the rushing yards, all that sort of stuff, it's not the worst in the world. It's like bottom 10. But now they add Quinn Williams in there. Do they get closer to average against Jeanty when his offensive line, kind of sucks? So it's that bad in the Raiders' offensive line with those injuries for them, where I don't really think they have the offensive line versus defensive line advantage against the Cowboys, which is saying something. Judkins, similar spot as Jeanty, I would say, in terms of that offensive line isn't the greatest. Baltimore is improving, like the Cowboys, but for other reasons. They've just been an incredible defense as of late, ever since the bye. Second best scoring defense. So yes, Judkins should get a lot of carries. Still has that ceiling touchdown potential. If they score, there's a good chance it's going to be a rushing touchdown from Jeanty. But I still don't love this Browns offense against a Ravens defense that has been pretty lights out after being the worst in the NFL. They've just changed a lot of things around. So that's one of those things where you look at the matchup on paper, it looks a lot better than what it actually is. Rachaad White, kind of close to him with the Bucs. He gets the Bills this week. The Bills, they are pretty good against receiving running backs, pretty bad against rushing running backs. So the matchup favors Sean Tucker. You would still start Rachaad White above him, obviously, because Tucker's not getting any of the receiving. But in terms of the matchup for White, I don't think it's that great. He hasn't been amazing recently, and this volume was inside the top 10 for 3 weeks in a row. And we've slowly seen him drop down this graph the last couple of weeks because now he's literally getting 50% of the running back touches in that backfield. He's not a super efficient running back. So even when he was good in fantasy back in the day, it's because he had top 5 volume. When he's been good as a handcuff, it's because he's getting top 5 volume. So now that he's getting top 20 volume, he's just okay in a matchup that's kind of just okay. Chase Brown up in the top left here. Without Jake Browning this year, he's the RB13, close to his ADP. Jake Browning was not good for him. But Flacco's opening things up. His rushing production, way better. That receiving is definitely increasing. Perine being out helps him a ton. Not a bad matchup against the Steelers, I would say, still, and should be a high-scoring game. And if they do get in a situation where they are just passing the ball a bunch, he could benefit there because as long as Perine's out, he's going to be running 90% of those running back routes, which I really like for him. Etienne, looking just at the volume in general, very consistent, and it got to a point where Tuden was taking a little bit more, and they kind of fell off. And ever since then, he's been getting a very high percentage of those running back touches, 15 touches in all but one game this year. And when we're looking at the receiving, that's been the key because that was the big worry, and I'm starting to get less worried. It's not the greatest. It's not what we'd want from Etienne at the start of the year or when he was a RB1 a couple years ago. It's not that level of receiving. But if we're looking at the targets, the first 4 games, not a single game with 4 targets. The last 5 games, he's had 4 of those 5 reach 4+ targets. So it's just been consistently better in terms of the receiving there, using him a little bit more. So I like that. Get him out in space with pretty solid offense, or at least, average. And these last 2 guys, still start him in most leagues, I would say. That is Swift and Cook. Minnesota has kind of shut down Swift in a way these last couple of years. He's played them 3 times, the last time being in week 1 this year. Hasn't scored a touchdown against them. Basically every single time, he's gotten really good volume and not too much production. But this year, Minnesota's defense, that hasn't been as scary. They're 18th in scoring defense right now. The Bears had 24 points on them in week 1. So it's not a spot where you're sitting them because of this defense, even though they have been pretty good against running backs so far. If you told me that the Bears scored 24 points again, yeah, you're playing Swift. He had 17 carries, 5 targets in week 1. It is only equal 9, 10 fantasy points, that sort of thing. And when we're looking at Cook, it's not the greatest matchup for him. Tampa Bay, their rushing defense, I would say even better than 11th, honestly. But they are 11th in terms of the rushing fantasy production allowed so far this year. He's not really getting too much receiving, but he is only in this red, I would say, because there are so many running backs this week that have really high projected volume. So yes, he's projected for the 20th best volume. I would say that volume is a lot better than most weeks' 20th best. There's just a lot of guys that have passed him, like a Waddle, Judkins, Marks, Harvey now up there, Warren shooting up. There's a lot of guys like that where that's why he looks lower, even though his volume hasn't really changed. So should get a lot of rushing production, should be a close game. If they can control this game at home, he should be plenty fine. But that's the video this week, guys. If you have any comments, leave them below. I'll try to answer them on Saturday afternoon around that time, and enjoy your weekend. See ya.